During last night's World in Action on the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, we inadvertently broadcast a photograph of Detective Constable Peter Reynolds of the West Midlands Police Commercial Branch, instead of former Detective Sergeant Peter Reynolds, previously of the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. We recognise that Detective Constable Peter Reynolds of the Commercial Branch has had no involvement with this Serious Crime Squad and apologise to him and his family for any distress or embarrassment caused.
At 10:35 tonight, we meet Harold Lloyd, described as the third great genius of the silent screen. That's 10:35 tonight. But now we go over to the studios of ITN for tonight's news at 10.
The two Germanys agree we can be one Germany soon. Mr. Mandela calls for votes, reform, calm and order. Labour tells Mrs. Thatcher you should be in prison. The fishermen who say they suffer from the polluted sea. And the eye on the stump that's better than any batsman's. Good evening. The leaders of the two Germanys agreed today that their countries will soon be one. The West German Chancellor, Herr Helmut Kohl, said unity is finally possible. And the East German Prime Minister, Herr Hans Modrow, said unity is drawing nearer. They started work on uniting their currencies. The four wartime Allied powers, the United States, Soviet Union, Britain and France, are likely to meet the two Germanys to set the terms for unification. The European Commission wants all the community powers to meet.
Hans Modrow, the East German leader in the West German capital Bonn today. It's the sheer speed with which the two Germanys are coming together which is driving so much else now. Today, for example, Herr Modrow talked to Chancellor Kohl about the possibility of the two countries joining their currencies and their economies together. They stopped short of actually deciding to do so, but Chancellor Kohl did say that a joint commission would start work on the idea. Such decisions like that and the constant stream of East Germans driven westward by their country's economic collapse, in effect the reunification which is already taking place, that's the motor behind the moves towards a summit. What's at stake is the reunification of the two halves of Germany that were separated by World War II. What's not at stake is a return to the pre-war Greater Germany. That included large areas of modern Poland and even a slice of the Soviet Union. Today, the reunification of Germany means taking West Germany's 62 million people, Europe's most prosperous country, skilled workers here earn £1,200 a month, and joining them on to their poor cousins. The 16 million East Germans will be outnumbered and outspent. Here a skilled worker earns £420 a month. At Downing Street tonight, where Mrs. Thatcher is giving a dinner for the Polish Prime Minister, she'll talk in a few moments about German unification almost as a foregone conclusion, but will add it is vital that it should uphold, not weaken, Europe's stability and security. So, Mrs. Thatcher will continue, it must be very carefully worked out in full consultation with Germany's allies and neighbours. But which allies and neighbours? Well, Berlin, surrounded by East Germany, half of it virtually part of West Germany, but all of it still run by the four victorious World War II allies, Britain, France, the United States and the Soviet Union, has provided the British and, it seems, the West Germans with the idea of a summit framework. And at a big international security conference in Canada today, where those same allied powers and East and West Germany have been meeting, the British Foreign Secretary has been pushing hard the idea of a six-nation summit.
We are quite close to an agreement on procedure, an agreement on meetings of the two Germanys and the four powers to discuss those matters which fall naturally within the scope of such a meeting. This strikes me as an admirable and common sense procedure. If agreed, and we're waiting for the final agreement of Moscow, if agreed, it will provide what the British government has long pressed for, namely a framework for such discussions.
All of that will be on the agenda when Mrs. Thatcher meets the West German Foreign Minister, Mr. Genscher, here in London tomorrow, as will the problems about bringing East and West Germany back together again. Will there be Western troops in East Germany now, as well as Eastern Bloc ones? Or should there be no troops there at all? Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
The Kirow Craneworks in Leipzig employs 2,500 people and exports to 25 countries. But like other East German factories, it's losing skilled workers as East Germans continue to migrate to the west at the rate of 2,000 every day.
The loss of our skilled workers is having a very negative effect, but we are trying to maintain at least a low level of production.
The shortage of skilled workers is putting the already fragile East German economy under increasing pressure. If the exodus to the west continues at its present rate, the economy could collapse.
Enterprises in cities all over East Germany are feeling the effects, but the brain drain is most acutely felt in the hospitals. Wards lie empty as more doctors and nurses leave the country. In Bitterfeld, East Germany's most polluted industrial town, factories now fly the West German flag. Workers here say only West German money can pay to clean up and modernize.
We think only a unified Germany will solve the terrible pollution. For Bitterfeld, it's almost too late.
Many East German factories are already preparing for German unity. This loss-making works in Leipzig makes parts for the Trabant car. They're setting up a joint project with West Germany's Volkswagen.
We expect financial and technical cooperation with Volkswagen to produce a new German car.
Many other East German factories are also trying to attract West German capital investment. Leno Glaser, News at 10, Leipzig.
Nelson Mandela has returned to the home in Soweto that he last saw nearly 30 years ago. 100,000 people gathered in the Soccer City Stadium to welcome him back, and thousands more blocked the roads outside. His message was uncompromising. They must be disciplined in the fight to end what he termed the dark hell of apartheid. Trevor MacDonald is in Soweto.
Good evening from Soweto, the town to which Mr. Mandela returned today, as he almost promised he would. Tonight, he's at home surrounded by family and friends, having had a home-cooked dinner and some sparkling wine. But that came at the end of an intensely political day. Today, Mr. Mandela told his supporters where he stood, and he spoke to them as an elder statesman would. He talked about the end to township violence, and he called on his people to reassure white South Africa. And to a cheering, emotional crowd, he said, "Let discipline be our guide, let education be our weapon in the struggle for freedom." Kevin Dunn followed Mr. Mandela's extraordinary day.
From early morning, they poured onto the streets of Soweto to welcome Nelson Mandela home. Clinging to anything that moved, they streamed from the township to see and hear for the first time the man who for them is the father of the nation. More than 90,000 people crammed into South Africa's biggest sports stadium to see their dreams of his return become reality. Long before his arrival, a celebration carnival was already underway. Once he appeared, the welcome was tumultuous. And so the leader, lost to generations, at last paraded before his people. Finally, they heard the voice silenced for so long. Mr. Mandela's message was of moderation, urging his followers to maintain discipline and rid the townships of violence.
The hijacking and setting alight of vehicles and the harassment of innocent people are criminal acts that have no place in our struggle. We condemn that.
He then pointed the way forward.
Go back to your schools, factories, mines and communities. We are going forward. The march towards freedom and justice is irreversible. I have spoken about freedom in my lifetime. Your struggle, your commitment, and your discipline has released me to stand before you today. Africa! Africa!
The message was left ringing across Soweto to those two who'd waited outside his tiny township house. It was the end of a long road home. Once there, the emotion of a man grown old in prison came through.
We have now reached 70 years. We can't have many years left before we close our lives. But because of the support and inspiration that you have given us, we will all sleep permanently with a smile in our face.
This then is the moment Soweto has waited 27 years to see. Nelson Mandela at last is home. Inside the house he last saw in 1962, Nelson Mandela finally savoured the company of friends and of family, and savoured above all the pleasure of simply being back home. Kevin Dunn, News at 10, Soweto.
For 3 days now, South Africa has been overwhelmed by news of Nelson Mandela. His every move's been followed, his every utterance carefully scrutinized. Today, the government attempted to fight back. The man chosen to put some government news back on the front page was GERRIT VILJOEN, Minister for Constitutional Development. Edward STOURTON went to Cape Town to hear the government's reaction to the Mandela avalanche.
President de Klerk's offices in Cape Town, the words of Nelson Mandela have been closely monitored. This afternoon, the man regarded as the president's intellectual guru gave them a cautious welcome.
On two important issues, the government is in agreement with Mr. Mandela. First, that the remains of apartheid must be removed, and secondly, the need for universal suffrage in a united democratic South Africa. However, we specifically find unacceptable his views on sanctions, on nationalization and on the armed struggle.
The principal concern that Nelson Mandela's commitment to nationalization will discourage foreign investment. Last night, the Conservative Party held what they claim was the biggest ever white political rally in Cape Town. There are fears that right-wing political opposition will become violent opposition. Today, Dr. VILJOEN warned that extremist groups could threaten the reform process.
We are aware that this whole exercise is an exercise involving risk. But important political development virtually always involves a risk.
Despite the rapturous welcome given to Nelson Mandela, the government feels it has the ANC on the defensive at the moment because the newly unbanned organisation still hasn't recovered from the surprise of President de Klerk's actions. Edward STOURTON, News at 10, Cape Town.
If Mr. Mandela is marking out a negotiating posture, one of the more remarkable developments of the last few days is that the government appears to be allowing him a great deal of political elbow room. When Mr. Mandela speaks now of the armed struggle, no government minister rushes into strident condemnation of the ANC. But that new acceptance does not necessarily help the black nationalist movement, which has a great deal of problems. Mr. Mandela knows the movement is split. What he may not realize is the extent to which he's being held up as the man who can put it all right. He keeps referring to himself as the facilitator. What the black movement badly needs